Okay, hello everybody. We're coming in for this week's video. I do realize it's toward the end of the week, and I'm also going to just say it out front here. We're not going to go ahead and do the Battle of Hastings at this time. I'm going to move that to some of a later date. Some things, of course, first and foremost, I guess I ought to cover something here, and that's the factor as of late, it's becoming a little harder for me to do the number of videos I would like to do on any given week, which preferably I would like to get 2 done a week, but that's not probably going to be possible at the current moment in time. So I'm going to go here and announce it from now on and for the foreseeable future, for at least till I would say March. I am probably only going to be able to do probably one video a week. So we will limit to that. So I'm just going to go out and say that. So anyway, in today's video, I wanted to change the topic. Now, it's still a world history topic, one that we've not really covered, and one that is of not so much a actual event, but more of a movement. This was a philosophical movement, and this is simply the Age of Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment, as it is commonly referred to in most history textbooks. Now, the Enlightenment was, or also as it is the word for it means age of light. Now, the Enlightenment was a social and philosophical movement that was most prevalent in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, during the 16 and 1700s. This was a movement that saw an enlightening of sorts of humanity. It saw the old traditions and old ideas of how the world worked, of how society should be, of government, of almost anything. It saw these old ideas and traditional beliefs being questioned and put under the microscope for the first time, really, of the human mind, of where humans, for the first time, are really looking back on these old traditions, saying, are they really current with what we need today? Are they still useful, or should we just get rid of them? How useful are they in a modern day society? Keep in mind, these traditions, some of them stretch back all the way back to like Roman times, for example, or the Greeks. So this marked the first period where humans really took a look at themselves and started to use a new human concept of the mind, and which was called reasoning. As we all know today, if you have a mind, you probably have to use reason every day. So this was really the first time where humans applied reason to almost anything that they could think of. This could be, how do we think a government should be run? How should people act when they're in public? How should science be? Well, I mean, what's the truth with science? Should there be this new, as the scientific revolution had already kind of begun, there was a question of whether or not do we accept what these scientists are supposedly telling us is true, or do we continue with the old ways from what the church is telling us is true and take that as granted truth. So people really, in the Enlightenment, it was not only an age of reason, but it was also a search for truth in many ideals. It was a search for change in many ways. Now, what caused the Enlightenment? Now, the Enlightenment was brought about by mostly about 4 different things. One was the humanism that had developed in Europe and during the Renaissance and had kind of persisted after its end in the 1500s. The concept of humanism, the thinking of individual thought, of humanity being almost a not a predestined race, but a race that was free to choose. Each individual was free to choose. Each human individual could choose what they wanted to do in life. There was the thought that you aren't supposed to be looking down for your descendants down the road. You are supposed to look at yourself and what your needs are. Individual thought was highly classified in Renaissance humanism. It also persisted in art form and many other things during the Renaissance period, and this continued. It was still in existence up until the uh, Enlightenment. Also, you had the rediscovery of classical culture and literature, mainly the classics of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, such as the Iliad or the Odyssey, or ancient Roman festivals and stuff like that, and other books that the Romans wrote, such as by Pliny the Younger and Pliny the Elder. Now, these were rediscovered. And when I mean rediscovered, I'm meaning that during the Middle Ages, people kind of forgot about literature. They forgot about the arts. They forgot of almost anything. I mean, they really didn't forget about them, but they no longer paid much attention to them because their lives were so bleak and dark that they really didn't see the point of trying to learn about the ancient classics or anything like that because they didn't really see how that would benefit them. I mean, think about the Middle Ages. It was castles, it was feudalism, mud, knights, disease, plague. It wasn't a very good time to be alive as a human being, and thus there really wasn't that much attention as people were more concerned about their own survival during the Middle Ages than they were about enlightening their knowledge. So the rediscovery of the classics really began in the Renaissance, and this led to a rebirth of knowledge and interest in ancient philosophers from Greece and Rome, such as Plato or Aristotle, and their teachings. You also had the methods and ways that had just been developed from the ongoing scientific revolution that had occurred in approximately the century before, with masterminds such as Galileo and Copernicus really changing the world of science and the world in the field of astronomy and determining that we were not the center of the universe, as many people had long thought that the Earth was the center of all things, that everything did not revolve around the Earth, but everything revolved around the sun. And this really was heretic back then. Most people thought that the earth was created by God, and thus the sun, the moon, and everything in the heavenly heavens revolved around the earth. This was something that had been accepted for centuries, and no one had really challenged that until the scientific revolution. Now, there were, of course, other advancements during the scientific revolution. There was scientific reasoning was really developed during that time, of which we would test ideas and hypotheses or theories, and this really got developed. So these theories, this method testing and thinking about them, gets transferred to the Enlightenment because people start deciding, well, if we could do this with asking things of the natural world, of the natural physical world, why can we not apply the same thinking and hypothesizing to the world of philosophical thought and of society? And of course, you also had the factor that the Enlightenment was somewhat able to occur because the Catholic Church's power had been somewhat weakened ever since the Reformation during the 1500s, during the 14th century. When the Reformation happened, as we covered in one of our previous videos, the Catholic Church kind of lost some of its influence in Europe due to the Protestant uprisings that began. So the Catholic Church had long kind of been the sole kind of ultimate word of sorts on determining how things were in the world. As any country, it didn't matter if they had a king or whatever, they were ultimately held themselves answerable to the Pope. So the church had a lot of power during the Middle Ages and up till about the 1500s when the Reformation happened. After that point, the Catholic Church was still in existence, but it was no longer in the amount of power, in the field of power that it had had and held prior to it. So a lot of these Enlightenment ideas, where if they had been held 200 years before, probably these people would have been deemed heretics and burned. Now they can get away with saying these things because the church is no longer going to be there to stop them. The church is no longer in full control of the countries that they live in. And that's another major thing we want to touch here. When we say the Enlightenment, it's more referring to the period, and it was a movement, but the movement was not united. It was not a unified movement where the philosophers constantly get together and just pop up all these ideas. No. There were many different Enlightenment movements throughout the different countries in Europe. There was, of course, some most prevalently in countries such as France, England, Germany, Italy, Spain. Mostly in major European countries, there was some form of enlightenment, of the Enlightenment period. There was some philosophers, as the French called them, that were kind of determining these new societal norms, these new reforms that they said the world needed, that the world should not be this way, it should be this way. Why? Because reason and thought tell us it should be so. Just common sense. Now, the sense of reason, as we mentioned, it's integral to the Enlightenment. It's really the main theme here was reason. And reason was very much a part of this, as because reason was a part of the Enlightenment, people believed that it held that reason was the key to change. They believed that reason or reasoning, the reasoning of the mind to kind of realize and really think through on things, people thought that reasoning was really the key to having the power to understand not only the universe and the world around them, but to help them improve their own lives. So they started using reasoning as a means of doing this. Now, one of the earliest advocates of attaining new knowledge through reasoning was none other than famous English mathematician and scientist Sir Isaac Newton. As you do not know and do not remember him from your science class, he's the guy that supposedly had an apple fall on his head and he magically realized that there was this law of gravity. If you still don't know who I'm talking about, right here's your portrait. That is Sir Isaac Newton. So, Sir Isaac was really famous, of course, for his realization of the law of gravity, in which he kind of realized there was an invisible binding force that was not only binding everything to the ground instead of letting it float off into the heavens, but he also realized that that same force was probably what was governing the universe as a whole. It was governing things outside of the Earth's realm. There was anything that was in the universe around the Earth was likely being governed by the same law. And Newton, of course, this was his major theory. And of course, this was somewhat of a heretic because this was saying that there are laws governing the universe, but this is not God. This is a actual thing that can be shown, can be provided, can be outrightly just kind of explained. This is not something of divine power. And this, of course, is going to upset the church and the Christians in Europe at that time who have long been told that God controlled and created everything in the universe. And where Newton's coming along, he's saying, well, we don't need God to explain the universe because I just explained part of it. Gravity is what binds it together, not the Lord, but gravity. Now, Newton, of course, discovered other things other than gravity. Of course, had other things like, for example, I believe he discovered the light prisms, the way that you could put light through a prism and you would be able to separate that light into the four different spectrums. Well, not four, but there's more than four, but the different spectrums of light that you see, like the rainbow colors, and when you put it through glass. He realized that's what that was, that was not just a magical effect, that was actually the glass was separating the different spectrums of light. But of course, Newton gets some arguments against him because, of course, this goes against traditional Christian teaching. It goes against what the world has been taught is right about the world. Now, reason came to be applied even to religion, which, of course, may not seem that bad. In fact, it never really spawned its own religion or cult. Reason never really did, and the Enlightenment never did. But the people that came to be called deists, who followed this little idea of deism, they did become somewhat of a, what would be the word, annoyance to the church, because this was definitely not Christian, but it was believing in God, but it was believing something entirely in what the common Christian believes. And the idea of deism, there are several truths. There are three main truths in the idea of deism and those who might follow its idea. And the first one is that there is only one God that exists. There's only the existence of one God, and this God acts as a master architect of everything. He acts as the grand architect, the builder, the planner of everything that has ever existed. There's only one. So they do believe in God. Two, there is a system of rewards and punishments that does exist in the natural world, of where people can either be rewarded or punished by God, and this is only controlled by God. And third, humans have an obligation to uphold the values that are of most beneficial quality to human existence, such as virtue, as the deists believe. Two of those values would be virtue and piety. They believe those were some very important values that humans should always obligate themselves to uphold in any situation. Now, you might ask, well, I don't even know what a deist is. Well, I can tell you right now, you probably know about one that you really didn't realize was, like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. He didn't explicitly believe in the Christian God, but he believed there was a God. Now, another idea that was touched upon in the Enlightenment period was psychology. Psychology was actually really it had been touched upon for centuries and even in ancient times, but the Enlightenment marked the first period where you get the very first modern theories to develop about psychology, and most of these come about by the work of two English philosophers, and that is the philosophers John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. They both played a heavy role in the field of psychology during the Enlightenment. Now, John Locke, he believed that the human mind was essentially a blank slate. It was like a whiteboard that had no writing on it. It was just a blank dry erase board when you're born. So when a human is born, their mind is just this plain white dry erase board, has no writing, nothing. It's just blank. It's like a blank sheet of paper. And Locke argued in his theory that over time, as a person grows older, gets old with age, that board is filled with knowledge and experiences throughout life as they go on. But each person's board would be unique due to that person's individual experiences in the real world. No one person's idea or mind would be the same because not everyone experienced things the same way. So he basically was saying that when you're born, you're thoughtless. You're just a blank slate, untampered. And as you grow older, that slate becomes dirtied, it becomes filled, and you gradually gain the personality that makes you you. He also basically argued here that natural good or sin didn't exist when you were born. It was something that came to be pushed upon you. It wasn't something that you innately had. Thomas Hobbes, the other English philosopher here, was much more cynical in his claim for human psychology, in which he claimed that humans were only moved by considerations of their own pleasure or pain. They would only move to do something if they could kind of look into the future and kind of imagine, like, oh, I'm going to have so much fun, or this is going to be so nice, or they're going to realize if I don't do this, I'm going to be in a heck of a lot hurt. Thomas Hobbes basically argued that humans were not exactly good beings. He argued that they had to go to almost extreme lengths to even be persuaded to move and do things. He argued basically that humans were primarily only interested in their survival and that the fulfillment of their life's pleasures. They did not really care about helping people. They didn't care about bettering the world. All they cared about was living and living the best of their life. That's all they cared about. Hobbes basically kind of put a stain on this by saying this was not going to get anywhere because humans, the Enlightenment can say all at once, but humans by nature are just these self-centered, egotistical little creatures that will always look out for their own interests. They have no interest of the others around them. This, in turn, the Enlightenment, what is one of the most significant things to come out of the Enlightenment here, and probably one of my favorites was the ideas that it gave upon political government. Now, keep in mind that at the time of the Enlightenment, most countries in the world, if not all of them, were ruled by a monarchy or ruled by like an authoritarian leader or even a dictator. There wasn't really any democracies in the world. Even the United States, the British American colonies were still pretty much colonies up until the very end of the Age of Enlightenment. When the Enlightenment came to an end in around 1780, the United States was fighting its War of Independence. So there wasn't really a true democracy almost the entire length of the Enlightenment, but yet these thinkers, in their political thinkings, came to kind of enshrine many of the ideas that have become so prevalent in a democratic republic such as the United States. Of course, this caused controversy back then because this was not a form of government that the world wanted. This was not a form of government that anyone in the world knew about. And of course, to those already in power, such as kings or queens, they would have saw this as a threat. Now, of course, the first one that we want to hit here is the French philosopher Montesquieu. Now, he had a much longer name than that, but most people call him by Montesquieu, as that's just simply the short name that he's commonly referred to today. Now, Montesquieu was the first to propose the idea that power should be that there should not be power invested into a sole ruler, a monarch, or like a king or a queen. The king or queen should not have absolute power. That is wrong because kings and queens are easily corrupted. They're easily gone mad. They can go mad with that power and abuse the people that they're supposed to be ruling over. So Montesquieu argues that instead of having a king or queen have absolute sole power, that power should be separated between branches of government. There should be a legislative, an executive, and judicial branches that, although they work together as the government as a whole, they are separated from each other. No one branch has all the power. Now, of course, now we know today that is part of American political thinking, that there is a separation of powers. You have the legislative branch of Congress, then you have the executive, which is the president, and then you have the judicial, which is, of course, the courts. The Supreme Court, of course, being the highest. Now, Montesquieu, of course, he lived in a time before the United States, and he lived in France. So he was more talking about things like a parliament as a legislative, a king or queen as the executive, and then, of course, the courts. The courts were still the same. And he wrote this idea in his little novella, The Spirit of the Laws, which was written in 1748. Now, another famous French philosopher also becomes quite influential in the Enlightenment, in the world of political thinking, and this was a French philosopher by the name of Voltaire. Now, Voltaire proposed that the unification of church with state was wrong. For centuries, as we mentioned, the church kind of held a lot of power over a government. People combined religion and government too closely, Voltaire argued, and he argued that because of this was part of the cause that had caused Europe to have all these wars within the last 200 years alone. Within the last 200 years prior to the Enlightenment, Europe had been constantly at war. Countries that somewhere in the continent had been warring with each other. And Voltaire argued that part of this reason was because they had combined church with, or religion, with state political matters. Voltaire argued that church and state should never be combined. Instead, they should be kept separate. The church should never be involved with government, as he said. They should be separated. Basically, the separation of church and state. Something that we have here in the United States today. And something that Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, actually was a very big promoter of. So keep that in mind. That's where that concept comes from, is this French philosopher named Voltaire, who really puts forward the idea that the church and state need to be separate. We do not need to have the church, the Catholic Church, or the Protestant Church, or whatever religion it is. We don't need them ruling a country because it makes them unstable. Voltaire argued that countries in Asia showed that this would work, as he argued that nations such as China and Japan appeared to be much more stable than European countries, but he argued that this was probably partly because, if you looked at China and Japan, they really didn't let religion tie in with government. They kind of kept them separate. And he argued that this was why they appeared so much more stable than European countries, because they kept religion out of it. Voltaire's ideal government that he would have loved to have seen using his methods was one which had a power-limited monarch who would be enlightened, who was enlightened. He had listened and read the works of the philosophers, and would then be advised not by an aristocracy made up of wealthy landowners, but by an aristocracy of intellectuals made up by Enlightenment philosophers. Of course, this never really happened, because, of course, at that time in France in particular, the French aristocracy was based upon lineage. You were born into it. You could not, and you could possibly marry into it, I think. Now, John Locke was another one. He suggests that in a world where the government could simply take away your rights, there were three natural rights that everyone had. Because keep in mind, this is the world of monarchs. The king could say, off of your head, you get your hand cut off, you're going to get thrown in jail. If the king said it, it was going to be done. And Locke kind of argued that no matter what they think they can take away from you, you are entitled as a human being to three natural rights that are given to you at birth. And unlike the rights that the king takes away, these natural rights can never be taken away. You have them for life. Locke argued that every human being from birth had the natural rights to life, liberty, and property. They would have these rights, and nothing can take them away except maybe the divine. But he argued that no king or whatever could ever take those rights away. Every human being was entitled to them. Now, another big one that comes about in the Enlightenment is with the philosopher of Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes was probably one of our earlier ones. He explains in his book, The Leviathan, in 1651, Hobbes argues that what the purpose of government was. Why do governments exist? And Hobbes basically came to the suggestion that governments exist to act as security and protection for their constituents. They collectively protect every one of their constituents in return for the service of those constituents. That the government's job was to protect and defend those people. And this was what he mentioned, Leviathan. And about a century later, we have another philosopher from Switzerland, who, by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau puts forward the idea pretty much the same of Hobbes. He really just expands upon Hobbes's original idea from the Leviathan. And what he does is Rousseau takes Hobbes' idea and say, yes, that is the purpose of the government. But what he adds on is in something that he wrote in his writing, the social contract, or the contract social, as it would have been in Swiss. And he wrote this in 1762. Now, Rousseau claimed, and this is probably one of the best pieces of political philosophy in the Enlightenment that I myself actually kind of admire and like. And Rousseau claimed that there was a social contract. It was not a figurative, physical contract that existed that was actually signed. It was mentally, intellectually. There was a contract, an unspoken, unworded contract between the government and its people. In this contract, there were two requirements: that the constituents would serve the government, and that the government would protect the people and their interests and defend them. The contract, Rousseau in his social contract argues one factor, and keep in mind of this. We say the government's role is to protect. Rousseau argued that a government gained its power from the people. He argues that if any point, although there is this social contract between a government and the people, in which the government provides protection and the people provide servitude for that government, he argues that if at any point in time that any government should become no longer fulfilling of their end of that contract, they're no longer protecting their citizens, they're abusing them or whatever, if any point in time comes that they do that, then by natural right, the people can choose to abolish that contract, end that government, and create a new one that will serve their interests, that will do the terms of the contract. So what Rousseau argues if he continues with Hobbes' idea that the government is supposed to protect you, but if the government fails to live up to its responsibilities and promises that it is supposed to keep with you, you do have a God-given right to abolish that government and go and create your own that will defend your rights, will protect you, it will serve your interests, fulfills its end of the contract, its end of the bargain. So Rousseau puts forward the idea that if the government's not doing its job, you can form another one by natural right. And this really puts, of course, this played in the American Revolution quite well. That's one of my favorites. So that is where Rousseau gets. Rousseau argues that this could happen because divinely appointed monarchs were entirely wrong. No monarch was divinely appointed by God, as he claimed, and he claimed that the real power to legislate was not with the king or queen, but with the common people. They could dictate what was going to be law. Now, what did the Enlightenment really bring here? I mean, there was much more to it than this, but this is just a brief overview video, really. The ideas of the Enlightenment were very much influential to the world as they eventually helped spark the age of revolutions that would begin when the American Revolution broke out in the Americas in the British American colonies in 1775. And then about 15 years later, they were also much prevalent because it also directly led to the French Revolution that started in 1789, in both of these revolutions, many of the concepts of the Enlightenment philosophers were taken into account, were used to create new governments, such as an example here in the United States, we have the natural rights that John Locke mentions are very similar and almost exactly the same thing as the inalienable rights that Thomas Jefferson mentions in the Declaration of Independence, except he changes the one of property to the pursuit of happiness. We also have the separation of powers here in the United States. The separation of powers, of course, is something that was developed by Montesquieu. You also have the contract social, in which both the French and American revolutions dictated was why they would break away from their government. The government that was supposed to be serving and protecting them was no longer acting in their interest. The time had come to abolish or break off from those governments and create their new one. So there's a lot of influence in the Age of Revolution, and it continued far beyond that. Many of the founding fathers, such as Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, were greatly influenced by many of the Enlightenment philosophers, such as Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Locke. For example, right here, I wanted to list off some Enlightenment philosophers we had. We had Thomas Hobbes, Isaac Newton, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and John Locke. We had all these men that lived in the 17th and 18th centuries that were so critical to the Enlightenment movement. Right here we have a portrait of Voltaire. He was actually a pretty nice looking guy, if I must say so. For most of the paintings I've seen back then, he looks like he was a very well looking guy. This was Voltaire, the one that kind of argued for the separation of church and state, in which he was a very big influence on Thomas Jefferson's mind. And right here we have John Locke, who proposed the ideas of natural rights that people have. So what were the accomplishments in general of the Enlightenment? Well, you had a couple. The Enlightenment eventually, it accomplishes that there is a belief that human history is not just this old cluttered record of things, but it is a record of progress, of how humankind has adapted and gotten better over the centuries. There is also the outcome that the very first modern theories of ethics and psychology come about. You have society is now basically a social contract, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau kind of illustrates that he believes in. You have the understanding of laws that govern the universe that comes about through Newton's work, such as the discovery of gravity, his Newtonian physics. You also have the use of reason, really brings about a lot of change. It really becomes used in human thought processes. And then, of course, you have the birth of 19th century Romanticism, which really is the successor to the Enlightenment. It comes about, starts at about 1780, and it continues through most of the 19th century, which is the 1800s. Romanticism, which there was a focus on romantic kind of things. We'll get into it at another point. I don't really want to try explaining it when I myself have trouble at times. So we'll get into that at another point. So I think that is what all we're here for today. This was more just a brief little overview of the Enlightenment. I understand there's probably some gaps here. If not, I will, of course, I will have a video on here at the end that you can look. I will provide a link to it if at the end of this video that you can just tap on, and it should go to it. That was fairly good at explaining the Enlightenment a little bit to me. So I will go ahead and have that video on there. It's actually from Crash Course History, so if you don't understand any of that, if you've never seen Crash Course History, I highly recommend you. It's very educational, even for adults, and I must say it's also pretty darn funny. It can be quite funny. They make learning history educational, but they make it very fun. So I will, of course, have that at the end here. So that's all for this video. Now, this coming week, we're going to go ahead and before we move back a little bit into our presidents, I wanted to hit something that the historical anniversary just kind of has occurred or is about to occur, and that was the founding of the Confederacy in 1861, 160 years ago this year. It was in February of 1861 that at that point the 7 seceded southern states kind of came together to form their own nation. What I want to talk about is we're going to have 2 videos in relation to that. The first one I want to talk about is how did the southern states ever get to that point? What brought them to the point that they thought they needed to secede from the Union and form this new supposed nation, which was, may I mention, was never formally recognized by any country. So when I say nation or country, in technicality, it never really was recognized. So it's a would-be nation. And we want to kind of look at what brought the southern states to get to that point that they thought that was what they needed to do, and really what kicked off the Civil War. The other video is it's not just, it is in recent years, but it's happened ever since the end of the Civil War. I want to address what would be the word here, the deplorability of the lost cause ideology. This idea that the Confederacy was a lost cause, that its cause was justified. It was not fighting over slavery, it was fighting over states' rights and a whole host of bunch of other different issues. And the only reason the North really fought the Civil War against it was because it wanted the economic benefit the South could give. This is entirely, I'm gonna flat out denounce it right here. If you believe that crap, you're just outright dumb. I will say that. You're dumb if you believe that. The lost cause it was solely invented to try to, what would be the word here, mask the outright absurdity of the South's claim of secession. It was designed to really hide the great evil that it had really been supporting, kind of hiding the fact that your cause was not all that justifiable. It was a very evil cause to be fighting for. It was about slavery, whether you want to point it around or not, because as I meant, I'm going to say this right here. I was watching a Crash Course History video recently, and I'll say this again when we do the video. But the guy on there, John Green, I believe is his name, he mentioned a very good comment. I think he was just trying to reference his younger self as he does earlier in the videos, and he made the comment that he was trying to act as one teacher and made a comment about how his teacher during high school at one point he had apparently come up to him and argued wasn't when the teacher told the students that the Civil War was about slavery. And of course, Mr. Green was saying that when he was younger, he asked the teacher, he's like, well, wasn't it about states' rights? And he claims that his teacher told him this. He asked him one simple question. And he asked him this. He's like, a state's rights to what? Answer that question, you lost cause believers. Answer that to me honestly. You say it was about states' rights. Okay. A state's right to what? I'm waiting. Oh, I know. Slavery. To keep it. If the government says no. Seems awfully plausible. So we will do a video on that because I really think it's important that we denounce that ideology. It was something that was really created by former Confederates, and it's something that it's quite sad to see how much of a prevalence it's taken in today's society. So the next two videos we're going to be talking about the Confederacy, not exactly my best favorite topic to talk about because of the fact that it was a very evil move by the Southern states. The cause they supported was evil to the core, and all that. But I feel it's important that we try to A, explain what brought them to that point, and B, why many people today got this misguided view about the Confederacy that it wasn't as evil as we know it to be, as I can tell you it is, and then other people are going to tell you, oh no, it wasn't that bad. Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was. So we're going to have two videos on that, and then once that's done, we're going to hit back into our president's videos. So we'll hit that when the time comes. So that, and since I'm probably only doing one video a month now, that's probably going to take us up, I'd say, through February here. So that will get us through at least for a little while. So anyway, that's what's coming up. So as always, that ends our video for today. So as always, like, subscribe, leave comment, leave suggestion, ask questions, make any of the normal stuff. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and close out here. So hopefully everyone has a wonderful week, as a safe week, and we will hopefully see you all back here to learn the next bit of history in a week. So have a good week, and may God bless you all.